guys are all so fortunate today because we are starting a brand new series. And we're going to be looking at the last part of Genesis, chapters 37 to 50 over the coming weeks. And this is the story of Joseph, okay? And, you know, we called it something kind of flashy, Faith in Technicolor, and most of you know what that reference is. But what we're really going to be digging down deep into is God's providence in the lives of his people as individuals and also as groups of people, okay? And we have a tendency to understand only one portion of God's providential care. We readily see the ways that God blesses us in good times and in fortunate situations, and oftentimes we don't allow our understanding of God's providence to encompass every circumstance that we face in this life. See, God doesn't let anything go to waste. God uses all of it, and when we can trust that he's going to do that, it changes our lives, it makes us stronger people through the adversity we face, and it makes our testimony in this world that much more powerful. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. And this morning, we are just going to get our first taste of Joseph's story. We're going to begin in Genesis 37 and read about the first half, verses 1 to 17, okay? And then, I hate to say it, some of you are going to be really excited about this, and some of you might get a little bit bored. I hope not. But I have a lot of groundwork to cover today before we really get into the meat of this story. And so, gear yourselves up for it, okay? All right. So, Genesis 37. Beginning at verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed in the land of Canaan. Jacob's father would be Isaac, okay? This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. Now, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Well, to make matters worse, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" Joseph replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, as I have already mentioned this morning, we're going to begin looking at the final section of the book of Genesis, chapters 37 to 50. And as you can tell, and as I've already told you, this is the story of Joseph's life. But, as I also said, I need to lay some groundwork. I need to set the stage so that we all understand what point in history this is, what has happened so far, and what is yet to come. And so I want to just give you quickly a brief summary of what we have in Genesis before Joseph hits the scene. So Genesis 1 teaches that the universe was created by a sovereign and yet personal God who is distinct from it, yet rules over it, and he is deeply involved and invested in it. It is God who sustains this world. He's not like the deist idea of God, a clockmaker that winds it up and then steps back, okay? Genesis 2 teaches us about ourselves, that human beings were created in God's image and then given the responsibility to be covenant stewards of this wonderful world that God had made. Genesis 3 and 4 take a little bit of a detour that we're still in as of today even probably. And Genesis 3 and 4 teach us that human beings rebelled against God, and that resulted in sin and death entering the world. But nevertheless, God had a plan of redemption, and he begins a line of hope virtually immediately through the seed of the woman, Eve. Genesis 6 through 9 tell us, despite human rebellion and despite this widespread depravity that has covered the earth, God still is in control. He still enforces his moral order in the universe. He brings judgment against great wickedness by way of the flood, but he is also determined to preserve a people for himself. And so, in the midst of this cataclysmic judgment, God chooses 8 people. 8 souls are saved from the flood. And then, a little bit later, God enters into a covenant relationship with a succession of family heads with the goal of communicating through that family his blessing to the entire world. And so this is evident in Genesis 15 to 24. Abraham and then Isaac begin to carry on the promises of God. And so God's promises are carried down from one generation to the next. But we see over and over again, not necessarily through the firstborn sons. And so it's from Abraham to Isaac, not Ishmael. It's from Isaac to Jacob, not Esau. And as we will see, it's going to be from Jacob to Joseph, not Reuben. And so time and time again, God shows his sovereignty not only over the universe and the created order, but his sovereignty in election as well. His sovereignty supersedes what would have been natural human practice, that a father's estate and his headship of the family would go to the firstborn son. God is a God of surprises, and he, at least thus far in this family's history, has superseded it. So, nevertheless, these covenant promises are passed from one generation to another, and in Genesis 37 here, we begin to see God providentially ordering all things to fulfill his promises to his people, to increase their numbers, to provide for them a land, to make them a nation, and subsequently to make them into a blessing for the entire world. Now, it's true that Joseph is central to the story that follows, but I want you to notice, I kind of read it this way so that maybe it would catch your ear. This account doesn't even bear Joseph's name. Did you catch whose account this is? Shout it out. Jacob. That's strange. Genesis 37, verse 2, this is the account of Jacob, and then it goes into Joseph's story. Now, this is kind of interesting to me, interesting to some of you, hopefully interesting to most of you, but the word used here in Hebrew is toledot. And there are a number of toledotes in the book of Genesis. It is the way that scholars kind of separate and divide this book that covers so much information. In some places, the Toledot is little more than a genealogy. But in other places, like the one that we're about to get into, it actually includes a history of whichever individual is named. And so, like I said, 10 times in the book of Genesis, these Toledot headings are provided to mark the progression of history and the succession of generations as human beings multiplied and filled the earth. I'm just going to read through them really quick. Genesis 2, verse 4, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Genesis 5, verse 1, this is the written account, Toledot, of Adam's line. 6, verse 9, this is the account, Toledot, of Noah. Genesis 10, verse 1, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. Genesis 11, verse 10, this is the account of Shem. 11:27, this is the account of Terah. Genesis 25:12, this is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's maidservant Hagar, the Egyptian, bore to Abraham. 25, verse 19, this is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. Genesis 36, verse 1, this is the account of Esau, that is Edom. And then here, Genesis 37, verse 2, this is the account of Jacob. And so the account of Jacob, the Toledot of Jacob, is the last of the Genesis Toledots. It continues the history of God's people all the way to the dawn of the new covenant. Where do we find that? Matthew 1, verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so the first words of Matthew's gospel, the first words of the New Testament, tell us that the history of God's people continues into the New Testament and into the New Covenant. And so the account of Jesus Christ, our Savior, picks up from all of these promises and this line from the Old Testament. And this is just kind of interesting to me, but notice how Jacob's Toledot, which spans most of the Old Testament and into the New, both begins and ends with a Joseph. Joseph was the first in Jacob's line to carry on the headship of the chosen family. Now we need to remember that the messianic line, however, did not go through Joseph. It went through Judah. But in the account of Jacob, the Toledot of Jacob, Joseph is the first family head to be mentioned. And then Joseph, the father of Jesus, would be the last before the new Toledot began with the coming of Christ. From Joseph to Joseph, God's plan moves in mysterious ways. Isn't that so cool? That is so cool to me. Sorry if it's getting boring. But you know what? getting back on track, this is the story of the church. Because the church, as we know, as we understand, began with the people of Israel. And so what follows then in Genesis 37 through 50, which we will be looking at in the coming weeks, this is church history. This is our history. And so it's important for us right off the bat to see two things that are going on, two things that are driving, that God is driving toward accomplishment in this section. And the first is that this section of Genesis tells us how God's people, Israel, ended up in Egypt. Now, way back in Genesis 15, God is talking to Abraham, and he says this: "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions." And so way back in Genesis 15, God had prophesied, God had told Abraham that his descendants would somehow get to Egypt and become captives there for 400 years. And this passage that we're about to get into, these chapters of Genesis, tell us how that came about. The passage also foreshadows God's other promise to Abraham about his offspring becoming a great nation, how that would come to be fulfilled. That's way back in Genesis 12. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." So you remember that God not only promised Abraham a son, he also promised that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And so this final section of Genesis tells us how we got there, how we got from there to where we got at the beginning of Exodus, after generations of Abraham's descendants had multiplied and flourished in that land, at least with regard to numbers. And so for our purposes, I've already kind of laid this out. The story of Joseph is, I think, a wonderful illustration of God's providence. God's providence through the whole spectrum of circumstances, what we would consider good circumstances and what we would consider bad circumstances. God's providence is displayed very clearly in Joseph's life and gives us a lot to think about. Now, like Isaac and Jacob before him, Joseph is presented here as the special, elected, chosen member of Jacob's family, and perhaps even more so than it had ever been before. We're told in our passage that Joseph was young. He was about 17 years old, and he was working in the field with his brothers, and we're immediately told that he brought back to his father a bad report about them. Now, let me just say, a lot of commentators go this way, and I've also heard a lot of pastors go this way, and perhaps you have too. They're quick to call Joseph a tattletale or a snitch or a brat, that he's being prideful and arrogant in this favored position in his father's eyes. You know what? Maybe. But I don't think that Genesis goes there. I don't think that Genesis is trying to lead us to that fact. I don't think it implies it. However, there are some things that the author of Genesis does certainly want to highlight and does certainly consider significant. And first, with regard to this bad report, we don't even know what it was. This is kind of us getting into the story with regard to this bad report concerning Joseph's brothers. You know, this really shouldn't surprise us, because Joseph's brothers, we know from earlier chapters in Genesis, have already engaged in some pretty shady and destructive behavior, okay? We had an incident where Reuben, the firstborn son, slept with his father Jacob's concubine. And we had another story of Simeon and Levi just slaughtering the people of Shechem because someone from Shechem raped their sister Dinah. We had this huge revenge story, just a terrible, bloody massacre. And so these men, Joseph's brothers, were reckless and they were ruthless. This has already been established in Scripture. So that's the first thing we should understand. Secondly, though, and it's very clear that Joseph was the obvious favorite of his father. And this caused tremendous tension in the family. Scripture flat out tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his brothers. And what's worse is that he didn't even try and hide the fact. He gave Joseph this multicolored tunic, and it must have been something pretty special because the same terminology that's used for this coat of many colors is used in 1 Samuel to describe royal robes. So of course, it caused Joseph to stand out in his family, and it functioned as this visible reminder, this visible representation that Joseph was Jacob's favorite. And well, the result was predictable. Joseph's brothers hated him. In fact, it says Joseph's brothers could not even muster up the civility to say a kind word to him. They hated him that much. And so once again, just as we saw with Noah, just as we saw with Abraham, just as we saw with Isaac and with Jacob, we have family strife in this promised line. But God, in his providence, is even going to use this family strife to accomplish his purposes. God has a plan at work even in the midst of this horrible family situation. Well, Joseph brought back this report at the request of his father. He's already the obvious favorite son, so his brothers already don't like him. And now it tells us that he also kind of functions as his father's informer. Not only to kind of watch over his flocks and herds, make sure there's nothing going on with them, but also to watch over the brothers and make sure that they're not getting into trouble. Then to add fire to that, or to add fuel to that fire, we have these dreams that Joseph has. And in these dreams, we have to say, those of us who know the rest of the story already, God reveals his plan for the rest of Joseph's life. And so we understand these dreams are a revelation from God. This isn't just something that Joseph made up. This isn't just something that was kind of his fancy. It's not something that he shared with his family because he wanted to further aggravate them. These are a revelation from God. And so in Joseph sharing these with his family, I tend to consider it naivety rather than poking a stick into a hornet's nest. But either way, Joseph shares the content of these dreams with his family. And really, it's not his fault that these dreams focus completely on him. It's not his fault. This is a revelation from God, remember. But of course, these dreams lead to more family division, and it leads to his brothers despising him even more. And you know what? It says even Jacob scolds Joseph for sharing these dreams. So yeah, Joseph is Jacob's favorite, but this was like, whoa, this is one step too far. It's like all of a sudden Jacob gets a conscience about his favoritism toward Joseph and says, whoa, you're going to make things way too hard on yourself, buddy. First dream is agrarian in nature. Seems to be a foreshadowing of Joseph's future. After all, it's going to be through the harvest of grain that Joseph's name and his fortune is going to be made in Egypt. That makes perfect sense. Second dream that features the sun and moon and 11 stars, that's little bit more abstract. But, the message in both those dreams is obviously the same, and the brothers nailed it head on. Now, even though Jacob rebukes Joseph for these dreams, though, he kind of does what Mary, the mother of Jesus, does years later at the birth of her son, right? He ponders these things in his heart. And that makes sense because Jacob has some experience with dreams that contain divine revelations. And he understands that maybe regardless of the way that Joseph shared them, these are dreams that contain a revelation from God, which means the dreams contain truth that cannot be contested. And God's revelation in these dreams of Joseph emphasizes one thing, that the life experiences that Joseph endures in his life are not the product of chance. The dreams are also recorded here at the beginning of the story so that we know that all of Joseph's experiences are the product of God's will, so that we can be encouraged in our own experiences and in our own circumstances. So even though Joseph is going to be the chief character in this story, the story is about God's providential will. So, end of our passage. Jacob decides to send Joseph once again to find his brothers as they are grazing their sheep in the region of Dothan. And I want you to think about what we've already kind of understood about this relationship, that Joseph's brothers hate him. They can't even speak a kind word to him. He's already shared his dreams about, his superiority over them that God has kind of revealed in his life. And so already that lit the spark of an already going fire. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire, so they hate him even more. And now, think about this. Jacob sends Joseph to go check on them again, far away from home. And Joseph's immediate response is, here I am. Yeah, I'll go. No problem. Now, this couldn't have been a task that Joseph would have enjoyed. And nevertheless, I think this illustrates that he was a conscientious man and also an obedient son. And so he goes off. But when Joseph got to Shechem, where his brothers were supposed to be, his brothers weren't there. Now, if that had happened to me, I would have had to have an inner debate there. Okay, they're supposed to be here, they're not here. This is kind of wilderness area. I could go north, east, south, or west and look for them, but I'm just going to get farther away from home as well. So he got to Shechem, his brothers weren't there. He could have simply returned home and reported back to Jacob. But instead, Joseph finds this guy wandering in a field, or the guy in the field finds Joseph, but Joseph takes the initiative to inquire about his brothers. And the man answered that they had gone to graze their flocks around Dothan. And so Joseph goes off. He's undeterred in his task. And so I also want you to see that Joseph, his favored status, God's choice of Joseph doesn't lead him to indolence and indifference. He is working hard to be obedient to his father, and he is faithful in carrying out his task. See, all of this feeds into God's providence, okay? His favored status doesn't make Joseph lazy. It drives him instead to kind of an extraordinary above and beyond effort. It doesn't lead him into a sense of entitlement. It empowers his effort, just as our favored status in Christ should empower our Christian lives. Well, there in the region of Dothan, Joseph would encounter his brothers. And we're going to read about this next week, but there, Joseph would be beaten up, he would be thrown into a pit, and he would be sold into slavery. There in the one place nearby the grazing areas of his family that happened to be on the merchant route to Egypt. Can you see God's hand in this already? Can you see God's hand in the movement of his brothers, their decision to graze their flocks not near Shechem, but near Dothan? Can you see God's providence in the faithfulness and the tenacity, the obedience of Joseph? Brothers and sisters, this is a story about God's providence. And here in Genesis 37, we also see a pattern being established that's going to continue throughout the Old Testament and into the New, how God's promised, sent deliverer is rejected by God's people, and particularly by his own family. But despite the malice of Joseph's brothers in what would take place, and despite the terrible circumstances that Joseph would have to endure, God advances his plan of redemption through his chosen deliverer. You see, I mentioned this at the very beginning. God uses what he will for his own purposes. And he even employs trials with his people to accomplish those purposes. And what's more, he wastes no adversity that he brings into the lives of his people. This is a great story of God's providence. And as we begin to walk it together, as we see God work in these mysterious ways, may we learn with Joseph to trust in God through all circumstances. That's where we're going to end it today, and that's where we're going to pick up next week. Let's bow our heads in prayer.